Afterwards, when Nicias and Demosthenes thought that the preparations were complete, came the time for the army to move. 2 days after the naval battle, it was a terrible scene, and more than one element in their situation contributed to their dismay. Not only were they retreating after having lost all their ships, and instead of their high hopes now found themselves and the whole state of Athens in danger, but in the actual leaving of the camp, there were sad sights for every eye, sad thoughts for every mind to feel. The dead were unburied, and when any man recognized one of his friends lying among them, he was filled with grief and fear, and the living who, whether sick or wounded, were being left behind, caused more pain than did the dead to those who were left alive, and were more pitiable than the lost. Their prayers and their lamentations made the rest feel impotent and helpless, as they begged to be taken with them, and cried out loud to every single friend or relative whom they could see, as they hung about the necks of those who had shared tents with them, and were now going, following after them as far as they could, and, when their bodily strength failed them, reiterated their cries to heaven and their lamentations as they were left behind. So the whole army was filled with tears and in such distress of mind that they found it difficult to go away, even from this land of their enemies, when sufferings too great for tears had befallen them already, and more still they feared awaited them in the dark future ahead. Now that is but a sample of the prose and masterful writing of Thucydides. This is Thucydides, The History of the Peloponnesian War. I think this is one of the greatest works of history ever written. It's astonishing. Thucydides knows, well, we'll get to him. We'll get to that. He makes a statement, a powerful statement in the preamble, but it's right here on the back too. He says, "My work is not a piece of writing designed to meet the taste of an immediate public, but was done to last forever." Thucydides understood. He wanted this writing to be read 2,500 years later, and in fact, here I am, a man, holding this book. I'm reading it. I'm deeply moved by some of its contents. I'm disturbed by other elements of it. And some elements still don't even shock me in the slightest. You can see elements of everything that was going on back in this day today. And this is what we're all about here. Why study history? Because the patterns repeat. The cyclical nature of history is something that's, well, I think a lot of people are waking up to that now. But anyway, Thucydides, History of the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides was a general. Why don't I just read the back here for you? Written 400 years before the birth of Christ. This detailed contemporary account of the long life and death struggle between Athens and Sparta stands an excellent chance of fulfilling the author's ambitious claim. The conflicts between the two empires over shipping, trade, and colonial expansion came to a head in 431 BC in northern Greece, and the entire Greek world was plunged into 27 years of war. Thucydides applied a passion for accuracy and a contempt for myth and romance in compiling this exhaustively factual record of the disastrous conflict that eventually ended the Athenian Empire. The scene I read from you at the beginning of this review was the Sicilian expedition. An example of how a great power can easily overextend itself, pridefully, I might add, and as a result, snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. So this war begins, the writing itself begins before the war. He lays out the geopolitical landscape. He tells you a little bit about Sparta, about Corinth, about Thrace, Athens, Corcyra. He gives you a little bit of that. And he understands that he's writing to an audience that's not going to be well aware of these things. Thucydides himself was a general of Athens. And you'd think that he would talk about himself a lot in this book. But the truth is, I'm actually sort of shocked at the lack of self-mention he gives. I can count on one hand the number of times he's even brought up by name. And he sort of views it as Okay, so he gets exiled after losing an important, I think it's a mining city. And what ends up happening is he says outright, due to this, I'm going to be able to document the war more freely. His goal was accuracy. He didn't show favoritism in this work. And he really, really does show that there's internal disputes that brought down Athens. Athens was the favorite to win this war. They were absolutely the better pick. They were a naval superpower. And part of what made them so devastating was they had these maneuvers on the water. They had their triremes, which were the ships that they used. They exercised superior maneuverability in ramming and tactics on the water. And part of that comes from the fact that before this war occurs, you've all heard of the account of Leonidas and the 300. Well, at the Battle of Marathon, what you have is Athens at one point actually has to leave its city and go onto their ships on water and become this naval faring people. And the experience that they have from that, it lends itself to their warfare, and they become this massive powerhouse in Greece. And so the war starts well for Athens. It starts all right, but then they lose a man called Pericles. He's a very famous man. And when Thucydides writes about Pericles' death, he basically says, we lost the war, because he's writing this as the war is over at this point. He says, we lost the war largely because of the loss of men like Pericles, sensible men they knew when their troops were despondent and when they needed a pick-me-up. And they knew when their troops were overconfident and when they needed to be brought back down about the dangers that faced them. Thucydides records that men like Pericles are why we lost the war, because he dies. He dies from the plague. There's a plague that hits Athens famously very early on. I want to say it's 2 years in the war. And Thucydides himself records that he had the plague. I don't remember exactly where it is. Here it is. Thucydides talks about the funeral oration of Pericles. Then he gets to the plague here. In this way, the public funeral was conducted in the winter that came the following of the first year of the war. At the beginning of the following summer, the Peloponnesians and their allies, with 2/3 of their total forces as before, invaded Attica, again under the command of the Spartan king Archidamus. Don't get on me for pronunciation. I've only read them. And the time when I was really going over the names and understanding it deeper, it's not quite as fresh in my mind. But he goes on to describe the plague in detail. The plague originated, as they say, in Ethiopia and Upper Egypt and spread from there into Egypt itself, in Libya, in much of the territory of the king of Persia. In the city of Athens, it appeared suddenly, and the first cases were among the population of Piraeus, where there were no wells at the time, so that it was supposed by them that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the reservoirs. Later, however, it also appeared in the upper city, and by this time the deaths were greatly increasing in number. As to the question of how it could have first come about, or what causes can be found adequate to explain its powerful effect on nature, I must leave that to be considered by other writers, with or without medical experience. I myself shall merely describe what it was like, and set down the symptoms, knowledge of which will enable it to be recognized if it should ever break out again. I had the disease myself, and saw their suffering from it. That's one of perhaps 5 times Thucydides mentions himself, and he goes into detail about this plague. There's so much about this book. This is a pretty sizable book, but it's easy reading. I think the hardest part of the book, get the Penguin Classic Edition. The hardest part about the book is you kind of wanted to understand a little bit more about the characters that you're reading about. I say characters, but the people that you're reading about. And so you're going to have to take the time to understand the roads. I marked this section here. You're going to want to examine these maps and really get an understanding of what is being discussed, which cities are attacking which cities. But fortunately, that's right here for you. You have Sicily and Syracuse. That account I read at the beginning takes place in Syracuse. Athens sent out, they got this man named Alcibiades, hypes up Athens and says, hey, let's send out this massive expedition. Let's fight while we're barely handling a war. They have the upper hand in the war against the Peloponnese. And they go, hey, why don't we send out another war, another battlefront against the Sicilians? We've been trying to conquer them. Athens overextended. And the destruction at the Sicilian campaign, mixed with the plague, mixed with the loss of leaders, mixed with the numerous, I'll say the innumerable conspiracies happening during this time period, led to the fall of an empire. On paper, Athens should have won. We know with Providence that that's not always what happens. Now, there's much more that I could say about this book. I could tell you about Demosthenes. I could tell you about the preface where he discusses Themistocles, this legendary hero of Athens. I could tell you about Gylippus, or maybe it's Gylippus, the Spartan general who basically defeated Necaeus at Sicily. I could tell you about all these guys, but you got to read it for yourself. You must read it. History is relevant, and reading this, you'll understand why. A man like Thucydides embarks on a quest. He makes it his life's work to ensure to you, viewer, that what you get today is an understanding of what happened then. History is set up of these events. It's a series of events. Some people want to say they're all unrelated. You know, this postmodern understanding of history that there's no meta-narrative, there's no thread connecting all the events of history, but there absolutely is. The Peloponnesian War weakened Greece, which saw Greece conquered, which saw Antiochus Epiphanes, which saw the rise of Alexander the Great, which saw his fall, which saw the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes, which saw the rise, and I'll say, of John Hyrcanus, which saw the infiltration of the Idumeans into Israel, which led to the time of Jesus Christ, which led to Rome at 70 AD, which led to, do you see what I'm getting at here? These things absolutely connect to each other. There are moments in history so impactful, so massive in scope and scale, that by not understanding them, imagine taking 5 years of your life and just removing it completely from memory and history itself, and just essentially trying to say that it doesn't matter, that this time period didn't matter. It's goofy. Anyway, do yourself a favor, pick up Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Maybe I should have written a script for this one, because this one does deserve it. But my hope is that the writing and the prose and the poignant speech of Thucydides will capture you from what I read in the first moments of this review. Anyway, we're pushing 14 minutes here. God bless you all.